is your guys' first KH talk. I can't wait to disappoint the shit out of you. Just absolutely ruin your expectations. You guys thought I had like smart things to say, like some interesting viewpoints and discourse? Fucking no. Are you kidding me? I made this PowerPoint a long time ago, like very, very many days ago. This is my opinion. So what you see up here, take this with a grain of salt. This is just how I feel, and I'm going to present my evidence for why I feel this way. And you don't have to feel the same way that I do about this whole thing, but I'm going to talk about why I feel that Remind and Base KH3 are entirely different games. And in order to do that, we need to kind of set the table. We need to talk about Base KH3's design first before we can get to Remind. Base KH3's design was very much centered around scale. One of the biggest selling points going into KH3 before it was even announced was you would be able to like jump off of a cliff in Olympus, and that would be like an area that you could explore, as opposed to the boxed-in worlds that KH2 provided, where there just wasn't any exploration whatsoever. Big, expansive Disney worlds with little to no loading screens whatsoever. This feeling of grand, expansive, large areas to explore and check out, and to accompany that, large amounts of mobs per battle. This wasn't entirely new, I think. I feel like Dream Drop also had a large amount of mobs per battle, but Dream Drop also had a lot of other issues to talk about, so KH3 really kind of ramped it up. Like, this was a big selling point for KH3, was just there's going to be so many enemies that you're going to be fighting all at once, because it's just such a big world. Bosses, the Heartless, everything. They're going to be Gygus scale bosses like Grim Guardianess and Skull. Just these big, giant behemoth bosses that you fight at the end of Disney Worlds. Kind of fits into this theme. To tie it all together, Sora's tools and situation command system were designed to dole out AoE nukes that kill huge clusters of enemies at once and deal large chunks of damage. It's not everything. That's not Sora's entire toolkit. Like, clearly Sora's toolkit is a little bit more diverse than just AoE nukes. However, like when you look at each individual thing, you kind of notice a trend, right? Keyblade transformations. When you get to a Keyblade transformation, you swing in wide, large arcing areas to hit multiple enemies at once. Finishers, usually they multi-hit, and there's like very, very forgiving large hitboxes. You get to the finish triangle prompt, and that usually is something that you use to just do lots of damage and hit in a big giant area with lots of iframes. When you get to Grand Magic is a much larger, much more damaging, much bigger hitbox than just your regular magic, and it's designed to deal lots of damage and dispatch large amounts of enemies all at once. Like Waterza, early on in the game, it's literally designed to take out entire chunks of enemies all at once. Shotlocks, the majority of them are designed to hit multiple enemies, give you iframes, and do lots and lots of damage, designed to just, chunk out a large amount of enemies at once. Freaking Lynx, right? Lynx do the same exact thing, like Simba, Meow Wow, Stitch. A large amount of them, even Ariel, kinda, but Ariel's more just focused on just Gygus scale bosses and doing large amounts of damage to them. And attraction flow is also the same thing. Attraction flow is just the way that the attraction rides are designed, is for you to kind of like move around in this big, large arcing path and deal lots of damage. So you notice this trend, right? You notice this trend with Sora's kit, and it is related to this theme of scale. It's related to this theme of large scale, large worlds, large amounts of mobs, big giant bosses, and Sora's tools are designed to accommodate for those sorts of situations, to just deal lots and lots of damage and hit multiple enemies all at once. And then we get to the humanoid bosses, and it's not like there were really that many humanoid bosses to begin with in base KH3, but when we did actually fight them, they have a disturbingly lack of a move set. especially when you get to the Keyblade Graveyard. You'd fight enemies like Marluxia and Larxene and Vanitas and Terranort and Zigbar and Dark Riku. You'd fight all these humanoids. They very faithfully recreated a lot of the moves that you saw in previous games. That was a big deal for me. I was like, that is so cool that they recreated these moves so faithfully from their original source material. But they only have like 2 or 3 of them max, and maybe a DM, maybe a combo DM, but that really was just about it. And I understand why that had to be the case, because you had to, it relates back to the theme of scale. Not only are you fighting, one of these humanoid bosses, you're fighting 2 of them at the same time. You're fighting 3 of them at the same time. So you couldn't have a shit ton of moves going on. But a lot of these humanoid bosses, just in general, just had only a handful of moves. They had one phase and one phase only, and maybe they would throw out a desperation move every now and then. That was even the same thing for Dark Inferno, the secret boss. The secret boss does not have a desperation move. He has 3 moves, and he interchanges them as you go through the second and third phase. That's it. That's all Dark Inferno had, and it's definitely something to point out as far as KH3's overall game design. Maybe not necessarily like as a obvious like, oh, this is just bad and so game bad sort of thing, but it's definitely something to point out because it's like it's a pattern, and we're gonna talk about this later. Enemies in general, this includes bosses, but bosses and enemies in general just kind of tend to ignore your existence and just walk around a lot of time. How many times have you guys fought like a rock ogre or something? They'll look at you and they just don't do anything, and then they just like walk around for like 3 minutes and they just let you wail on them for just forever. Absolutely zero interaction outside of like every 30 seconds they might throw out an attack against you. It's the same thing with bosses too, almost to a certain extent, where like a boss will finish their attack sequence and then they'll just like sit there and they'll just like wait for 10 seconds for you to attack them, and that's like their opening. Just like very weird. It's just very, very weird. That's what I want to point out. It's a very weird, quirky design on Osaka Team's part when it came to just enemies in general, where they would just kind of walk around and ignore your existence. And then all of a sudden, oh, I guess, now is my time to attack. And then they just kind of do that. So yeah, that's base KH3's design. That's kind of the lead in to what we're going to talk about in the next sequence, which is Remind changes. Remind felt like an improved endgame to KH3 across the board. As far as like the Remind scenario is concerned, like the story scenario, a lot of the bosses were improved to some extent. They threw in like an additional playable character for you to try out in as you go through these boss fights, and that's kind of like, they're throwing you a bone, but I wouldn't really say that's a huge improvement to that boss fight. But once we get to like Scala, for instance, fighting like the 13 armored dudes in the base game was just a gigantic fucking clusterfuck. And in Remind, they transformed that 13 armored fight into its own little set piece, right? It turned it into its own little set piece, its own little mini game. And it felt like it made a lot more sense. Like even though it wasn't you actually using the combat system to fight these guys, it felt like, okay, well, this is a lot more manageable, because fighting those 13 dudes by themselves was just a huge pain in the ass outside of like spamming the shit out of Aroga or using Simba or using the Ultima shot lock to just kind of cheese them because they all share the same health bar and you can hit them multiple times. It felt like that little set piece kind of helped out a lot. And then you get to Goatnort, and Goatnort again was just kind of there's a lot going on there, where the level design is just really questionable, and a lot of the time it gets in your way rather than actually being helpful. the underwater segment. Oh god, the underwater segment. And then you're flying too afterwards in the third segment, and that can get in your way a lot. And when we get to Remind, the Goatnort fight where you can either play as Sora or Kairi, it's so much more polished. You're just fighting on a flat surface. His moveset is still kind of more or less the same, and there's like a little bit of jank to Goatnort's moveset, but at the very least, it felt like there was a lot more fluidity. Like they took that fight and they cleaned it up a lot more. It was just 2 phases. There were no weird gimmicks, and there was like a DM with the meteor, and that was pretty much it. There was really nothing else to it, and I kind of appreciated that. I was like, okay, well, this is kind of like what Goatnort was supposed to be. Like it felt like this is what they were planning to do with Goatnort, but they couldn't get it on the first go. I swear to God, if I air step to Goatnort and I go to a fucking pole instead of Goatnort, I'm going to lose it. Man, I've had that happen multiple times, and whoo, man. I appreciate the effort that they went into making that big weird arena where you could like fight sideways kinda and wall run everywhere and flow-mo everywhere, but there was no flow, which is ironic. There was no flow. It didn't make sense to be fighting anywhere on the walls or arenas or anything like that. It made way more sense to just get to the bottom of the arena where it was nice and flat and fight Goatnort there. Yeah, exactly. It was ambitious, but not executed well. Absolutely. And then we get to Limit Cut and Secret Episode. Man, I've been waiting. Boys. This is it. This is it right here. So why was Limit Cut and Secret Episode so dope, right? Why did this work out so well? Well, they completely gutted the focus on AoE nukes, I feel. They gutted the system. They really did. Like when you look at everything that I explained earlier with the shot locks and the grand magic and the Keyblade transformations and the attractions and the flow motion and the whatever, like all the shot locks, whatever, links, all of those things, like the vast majority of them were just like straight up gutted. And the focus of the gameplay was not on using AoE nukes to just do lots and lots of damage, right? Like links are almost entirely pointless and not useful whatsoever. Shot locks are still there, and they still, increase revenge value a little bit, but it's not like you're going to be using shot locks to carry you through a shit ton of the fight. Team attacks, straight up gone. There are no team attacks to be found. There are not many team attacks to be used. Grand Magic is just a kind of a part of Sora's kit in the first place, and there's really nothing wrong with it being there to do some extra damage if you want to use your MP to make some Grand Magic. So there's nothing wrong there. The Keyblade transformations they still have their own transformation attacks and all that shit, and they can do lots of damage, but the design is way less around these gigantic large mobs and these gigantic Gygus level bosses where the game just kind of had to hand you a big AoE nuke every now and then just kind of for standing around. Like, oh, you're just standing there. Here, let's give you like a goofy bombardier or a flare force or a rocket thing from Toy Story or whatever it is. Like, instead of getting any of that, they just decided like, okay, we're just going to make this very, very like moment to moment centered. We're going to focus on the moment to moment gameplay here as opposed to the big like press triangle to do awesome thing on the left side of the screen, right? And that's kind of what worked out in their favor, where they didn't focus on any of that stuff and they just focused on how to make a really nice moment to moment engaging fight with these bosses. And you know what? Shit, I didn't even mention it here, but like, yeah, like the bosses went from 2 to 3 moves with maybe a DM to having a ridiculous moveset. Almost every single one of these bosses, actually every single one of these bosses has a ridiculous moveset and potentially multiple DMs, and they switch things in multiple phases and they switch things up. It completely makes it a more engaging, a more like fast-paced centric experience. Focused on creating satisfying dodge versus guard scenarios. With the kit that KH3 was given, with KH3 Sora's defensive abilities, they decided, well, it's really satisfying to land these reprisals. So, we're going to, introduce a lot of situations or openings where you can land these reprisals in different ways. And let's mix that in with certain attacks that are unblockable. You can't block them. So you have to you got to roll through them. You got to air slide through them in certain situations. And you could even expand upon that with bosses like Xemnas in particular, right? Where you realize, oh shit, I can dodge the vines, and that gives me an entirely different moveset, especially in the second phase and in the DM phase. If you successfully dodge the vines enough, it leads to an opening at the start, and you can get a reprisal off of that. And there's even more reward for trying to engage with this dodge versus guard scenario that they're throwing at you. Bosses no longer have the weird Osaka tendencies. So you remember earlier how I was talking about how the bosses will do this weird thing where they'll just kind of ignore your existence. They won't be very aggressive. They would just kind of float around and just kind of wait for you to just randomly attack them. And it's oh, that's their opening. Well, it's not really a thing with these limit cut bosses. It's very much just a systematic, they do their attack ends, they do their next attack. There's no waiting whatsoever. There's no long delay or any weirdness at all with the Osaka's tendencies or anything like that. They have plenty of they have their moveset, and they cycle through it, and it is it's a fast-paced, engaging experience. Retained trademark flashiness without being intrusive or sacrificing depth. So one thing about KH3 and a lot of more modern Kingdom Hearts games is that they really like to turn up the flashiness, right? They really want to tune up the flashiness to 10 or 11. With KH3, one of the biggest concerns in the trailers was that they kept on taking the camera away from you whenever you would do a finisher and make it so that you can't see where certain enemies are. They would basically, take control away from the player just to show off how cool and flashy everything that you're doing is, right? And they still do that to some degree. You can't turn off the team attack camera being taken away from you. You can't turn off the finishers on Keyblade transformations. You can't turn those off when you press triangle. You have to watch it from the cinematic point of view. And it's kind of annoying, but you can turn off the majority of it and it's not too bad. But with a lot of bosses in KH3, they really wanted to turn up the flashiness. And a lot of times that kind of came at the cost of actual player agency and player control. And it would make a lot of fights just kind of feel really janky and weird. But with the limit cut fights, they were able to retain that trademark flashiness without it ever being intrusive at all. I bring up the Xemnas fight again because the Xemnas fight DM is probably one of the flashiest, coolest things I have ever seen in a video game. Instead of just it being a cutscene like it was in 2FM, you actually act out dodging and guarding through the laser dome yourself as a player, and you're able to see all the cool lasers coming out, and you're very, very clearly able to time when to dodge certain stuff, when to guard the lasers. You know when a unblockable laser is coming, and you know the timing for when to dodge that. None of this comes at the cost of being intrusive or feeling unfair or sacrificing depth or anything like that. The flashiness is still there, but for the most part, it's still very, very fair. I'm thinking about stuff like Master Xehanort DM too. Oh man, so many flashy attacks, so many flashy desperation moves, but they all still feel extremely fair, and they don't feel like they get in your way or they're unfair outside of the Syax DM, which is bullshit, but that's fine. That's just 1 out of 13. I'll give you that one. I think that's really, really amazing that they were able to do that they were able to retain that trademark flashiness that Osaka Team is known for, but they still make it fun to play. That's not something that Osaka Team normally does. Normally, if things are super, super flashy, it comes at the cost of player agency somewhere, somehow, some way, and it's always annoying as shit. But it's not the case in Limit Cut, and it's actually mind-boggling. It's amazing. It's a crazy accomplishment, and I gotta give them I gotta give them a round of applause, man. I'm gonna dap them up. They did a good job here. They absolutely did a good job. Made changes entirely for the player's benefit. This is a small thing, but in base KH3, as a lot of people know, guard doesn't always work on every attack. And sometimes that's really annoying. And it's really annoying and really unfair, and it feels like one of the game's core defensive mechanics is not working properly. But in limit cut, for attacks that are hitting you at multiple different angles, high-low, behind you, whatever, they are very, very generous about giving you iframes or letting your guard activate, even if it feels like you're being attacked from behind and you don't have a 360 guard working, right? Like, again, I'm going to bring up the Xemnas laser dome situation. When I saw the laser dome, I was like, fuck, that's going to suck because there's no way that you're going to 100% every single time be able to guard that shit, because it's just going to plop you in the back. But that doesn't happen. It is extremely generous, and I feel like they very purposefully designed certain attacks to just activate your guard no matter what, even if it hits you from behind, just to be like, okay, we're just going to give you guys a solid. In this situation, like, we're going to make it really easy on you. We're going to make it really fair, because we want to retain that flashiness. We want to retain that cool shit, but we don't want the player to feel like shit. So let's just let them, take this one. Yeah. Limit cut's fucking dope. Remind's dope. Even the remind scenario, which is like iffy, even then they improved on certain aspects. Oh fuck, I forgot about the Scala aspect. Yeah, Scala has interesting level design. I don't know what else to say. The majority of level design in KH3, while it's big and spacious, is not very intriguing. But Scala actually feels like it has somewhat intriguing level design, and I thought that was really cool. Ah, yeah. Shit. So this is where I pull out my tinfoil hat, boys and girls. I have rarely ever seen a dev team pull a 180-degree turn and go back on their entire design philosophy in the next game or final mix of their current game. I have never seen anything like this. Normally when people do like a final mix or they do a sequel of something, normally it's just like, it's very incremental, the improvements, right? Like over time, it's just like a very, very incremental, like it's, you go up on a, at an incline up the mountain, and you see these changes happen over time. But with Osaka team, they've stuck with the same design philosophy for like literally the last decade, since Birth by Sleep. From Birth by Sleep to Birth by Sleep Final Mix, to Dream Drop Distance, to 0.2, to base KH3, and then you hit KH3 Remind, and you go from just like this straight line to boop, and you're all the way up here. It's like, what happened? What the heck? I have never seen a design team be, super about scale and flashiness and all this other shit. And then all of a sudden, they're just like, you know what? Let's think about the player for a second here. Let's make these bosses way less about the scale and way more about, let's make these bosses really, really cool. And like, they're going to have crazy moves, and, they're going to have crazy desperation moves, and they're going to be really, really fun to fight. And it's going to be way more about just like the moment-to-moment dodging versus guarding scenario, instead of all that other crap that we've been working on this entire time. Like, I've never seen a dev team just take the playbook and just throw it in the garbage and just be like, fuck it, dude, we're gonna make it like this now. Because even with Birth by Sleep, like the transition between Birth by Sleep to Birth by Sleep Final Mix in terms of super bosses was literally just like, we're just going to make a cool super boss. We're going to make Armor of the Master, and we're going to make No Heart, and they're going to be cool looking with cool animations, but it's not going to be very fun to fight, and you're going to still have to do the stupid Thunder Surge shit and Shotlock spam and abusing of iframes and pack up a shit ton of cures and all that other shit in order to go through those fights, right? Like it was still the same design philosophy that Birth by Sleep had, but Remind is a total fucking 180, and it blows my fucking mind. And I have thought about this shit, and I'm just like, how did this happen? And this is where I break out the tinfoil hat. And I want you guys to know that I want to be on Osaka team's side. I really, really want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And that's why I'm going to attempt to give them the benefit of the doubt when I talk about these points here. The first possibility is the main dev team learned and improved from their first shot at a next-gen console, and they had a full year to work on this small DLC package. I think there's a lot of truth to this first one, for sure. Osaka team had not worked on a mainline console game since 2006 when they made Recom for the PS2. And technically they worked on 0.2, but that was really just like a tech demo, right? But outside of 0.2, it's been over a decade since they made anything for a next-gen console, and it was on the PS2. And now they're being expected to make a mainline, like the next numbered Kingdom Hearts game, and it's going to be on Unreal Engine 4, and they've never worked on Unreal Engine 4 before, and they've never made a game for the PS4 ever. They've only been making handheld games up to this point. I think it's very, very safe to say that Osaka Team's first shot at a next-gen console game is going to come with some learning pains. There's going to be some growing pains here in their first shot. And it makes sense that after they made base KH3 and they learned everything that they did from that experience, they were able to spend a whole year just working on the small DLC package and make it as good as possible and learn from all their mistakes. I think that there's definitely some truth there. But at the same time, I still think about games like Birth by Sleep, and I'm just like, well, yeah, with Birth by Sleep in their, final mix package, they just kind of threw in some super bosses and they called it a day. They didn't really do any system changes. It still felt like shit. And so I'm kind of like wondering like what the fuck's going on there? And then there's point number 2. They were rushed to meet, or what is it? The theory is they were rushed to meet a deadline for base KH3 and thus didn't have any time to fix things. Okay, so first of all, I think that there is a lot of evidence to suggest that KH3 was very much rushed. The biggest thing that I can point out probably is Scala, for instance, was one of the first things that Tetsuya Nomura mentioned, and he was really, really excited about it. He was excited about the idea of Cable Town. He was excited about this crazy old ancient Keyblade town, and it was the homeworld of Xehanort. This was supposed to be like a really big deal. He was really excited about this sort of thing. And Yoko Shimomura made a whole full-length soundtrack for Scala. It was this this beautiful, beautiful theme for Scala. And in the base game, in the actual game itself, it plays for 5 seconds. 5 seconds before you walk left or right or forward, and then all of a sudden you fight the armored dudes. The armored dudes show up and they ruin the music, and you never hear it ever again for the rest of the game. There's even weird shit. There's weird shit like the most of the guard fails. The majority of them only show up at the very end of the game. Why is this game franchise that is 100% known for Yoko Shimomura's music? Why is the final battle of this 20-year-long saga being composed by anybody outside of Yoko Shimomura? Why is it being arranged by Ishimoto? Why is it in synth? Like, what's going on? Like, there's so many weird things about the ending of this game that have me thinking like they had to have been rushed for time, man. Like, the only thing that answers this question for me was that they were rushed for time, and Yoko couldn't compose everything, and they were too ambitious with Cable Town, or too ambitious with Scala, and they just didn't have enough time to work on it, so it just turned into this little battleground for this one particular fight or a few particular fights. That sort of stuff leads me to believe that Osaka Team was very much rushed to meet a deadline. Like, they already lost a year and 18 months or so of development to trying to work on the Luminous engine, and then they decided to scrap all that and work on Unreal Engine instead. So they lost all of that dev time, and you could make a case. This is my tinfoil hat that I'm wearing right now. You could very much make a case that Osaka Team designed a battle system. They designed Sora's tools. They designed the worlds. They designed the mob fights, and they decided, okay, cool. This is what we have right now. This is what we're working with right now. But we're really crunched for time, and we've got to finish these. We've got to finish these Disney worlds because Disney wants us to make them a certain way. We've got to wrap up certain things that Nomura wants for the story. We've got to design these fights a particular way. Nomura keeps on rewriting the ending and we don't know what's going on, so it's really hard to design any sort of fights for the ending when we don't know what the ending is going to be. Like there are a lot of things going on that would suggest to me that they didn't have enough time to polish the gameplay for KH3, and they just kind of made what they could and they just kind of went with it and just kind of hoped for the best. That's my tinfoil hat. That's kind of like that's me being generous. My belief is that like it was a rushed game and they couldn't do everything that they wanted to with the game, and so there are certain issues that show up, and the gameplay I think like there's definitely a part of it. And then when they made Remind, they were just like, we're not pressed for time. We can actually work with what we, within a very nice time constraint. And because of that, and because of everything that they learned from that first go at KH3, they were able to make something a lot more fluid, a lot more solid, a lot more engaging with Remind. Number 3. Please, I really hope that it's not this. I truly, truly hope that it's not this. But there is a part of me in the back of my head that feels like there might be truth to this. And that thought in the back of my head is they intentionally designed the base game differently for the more casual audience, because they felt that if they put quote unquote data fights in the base game, then fans wouldn't be receptive to it. They wouldn't like it. And when I say put data fights in the base game, I'm not actually saying that. I'm saying you take the design philosophy that is Limit Cut. You take the design philosophy of Limit Cut and you make small scale, easier bosses in the base game with those same design philosophies, right? Because to me, there's a part of me that feels like if you had the ability to make these amazing bosses, these amazing, beautiful, flashy, but engaging and fun, challenging bosses, if you had the ability to do this from the very start, why aren't you doing it in the base game? What's the reason? Is there somebody saying that fans won't like it? Or do fans need it to be a lot, do fans need it to be different, to be more casualized, I guess? Like is there actually like a design philosophy where they're just like, well, the base game has to be for casual fans, but when we get to Remind, then we'll actually make some really kick-ass bosses for the hardcore fans. And I desperately don't want that to be true. I desperately don't want that to be true. But there is a part of me that's like, as shitty as it sounds, I could see them doing that, but I really desperately don't want that to be the case. The only reason that I think about that sort of thing is in 0.2, right? In 0.2, I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the majority of the enemy design in 0.2, including bosses, not that great, not very solid, not that good. And then you get to Zodiac Aqua, and suddenly it's like we're playing in a whole different game. It's like, where was this boss the entire time? Where was this design philosophy? Where was this idea where there's DMs that you have to memorize and you have to learn how each individual attack pattern works and counter it appropriately? Where was this stuff going on? Why wasn't it in the base game? And it's really weird to me that they've never incorporated those ideas into the base game. It's really, really, really weird to me. I don't know. I wish in the base game there were more diversity in the Keyblades and the transformations. You know what? There's even more evidence to suggest that they were rushed. There's even more evidence to suggest that they were rushed. You guys remember the Forge area in Olympus? That secret area that had a lucky emblem and you could make a shield for Goofy, and it was like this own little area, and it was cool to discover on your own. And it was this own little secret, and that gave you a really awesome sense of exploration. But then they stopped doing that. But then they completely stopped doing that for the rest of the game. And then you look at the Keyblade transformations, right? The most engaging and original Keyblade transformations that I can think of were early on in the game. Hero's Origin and Counter Shield, that's the first new Keyblade that you get. shooting star and the double arrow guns. That's the second Keyblade that you get. Ever After and the Mirage Staff. Again, that is like all of these are early game Keyblades. I'm not trying to say that like all the late game blades sucked, but they definitely started to feel a lot more samey. Is that they started to make copy blades as they continued. Fucking Monstropolis and Arendelle back to back are literal copy blades of each other. At least like the first transformations were. The Pooh blade is a copy blade. The blade that you get for doing all of the little phone game things. Grand Chef is a copy blade too. Like what I'm trying to get at here is that it felt like towards the beginning of the dev cycle, they were very, very creative, and they had more room for creativity and more room to try out cool shit like that, right? But as you get further and further into the game, it's like, oh shit, the copy blades start popping up, and then you get to Scala, and you notice that Scala is extremely rushed, and it definitely isn't what it's supposed to be. Like there are so many different things that you can point to suggest that KH3 was 100% a rushed video game. Not an incomplete video game, because it very much was a completed game, but it was rushed, and they didn't have enough time to do everything that they wanted to do. I think that much is very true, and I think like that sort of stuff really permeates throughout the entirety of the game. Whenever I say that Remind and Base KH3 are entirely different games, it's because when it comes down to it, it really truly feels like there is not only just a different level of polish, but almost a different level of design philosophy going on when you compare Remind to Base KH3. And I think a large part of why that is, I mean, I'm never going to know exactly why that's the case, but I think a large part of that is because, one, they improved on their first go-around at making Base KH3, and they probably had a lot more time to make bosses and make the combat system and make certain things the way that they wanted to, and give it a lot more polish, because they weren't so rushed like they probably were when they were making Base KH3. I'm sticking with those two. I'm sticking with those two because I want to give Osaka Team the benefit of the doubt. And Remind is dope. And I think the good news, really, like I want to end this on a good note. The good news is that KH3 is done. That dev cycle of hell is over. We don't have to worry about it. We can focus on the next game, and that next game is not going to have that terrible dev cycle. We have a team that has already, worked on Unreal Engine 4 and made a game for next gen, and all of those things that they learned with Unreal Engine 4 are probably going to transfer over to Unreal Engine 5 and shit like that when we eventually transition between the PS4 to the PS5. I think the future is bright. I think the future is definitely bright as far as what we're going to see in future Kingdom Hearts games. Maybe it's not going to be perfect. I don't think it ever is going to be perfect, but I think it's definitely on the up and up. I think it's okay to be optimistic about the future. I think it's absolutely okay to be optimistic about the future.